Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Welcome to this webinar hosted by Texas 2036 and States for the Future on data centers and state policy, governance strategies, and policy insights. My name is Jeremy Mazur. I'm the Director of Infrastructure and Natural Resources Policy for Texas 2036. Now, if you work in the policymaking arena, hardly a day goes by where the subject of data centers does not come up. And this is certainly true in Texas, where state leaders and legislators are asking big questions about data center development. These questions include: how much water do they use? Where do they get their electricity from? What do data centers mean for state and local revenues? And among other questions, what are the economic benefits or disadvantages attributable to data center development? Now, Texas lawmakers are not alone in asking these questions. Legislators and leaders in states across the country are substantively engaged in similar conversations. These policy conversations and questions in Austin, Tallahassee, Sacramento, Albany, Baton Rouge, Richmond, and other state capitals is very similar from what's going on in Austin. So this afternoon, Texas 2036 has partnered with States for the Future to explore how other states are addressing these questions relating to data center development. Now, for a little bit of background, if you don't know about us, Texas 2036 is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, data-driven policy organization working with Texas leaders and legislators on a variety of issues, including water, energy, workforce development, healthcare, and among others, public education. States for the Future, which you can visit through www.statesforthefuture.org, is a collaboration of nonprofit, nonpartisan organizations working to address the challenges facing individual states and the nation. States for the Future Network is grounded in the belief that good policy stems from quality data and research, and that states, as laboratories of democracy, can drive better outcomes for residents by making data actionable and adopting long-term strategic planning. Texas 2036 is a proud member of States for the Future, along with other members, including the Center for the Future of Arizona, the Utah Foundation, and Leaders for a Better Louisiana. Okay, with that said, here's our agenda for this afternoon. Our first speaker will be Louisiana State Senator Thomas Presley, who will share his perspectives on data center development in the Pelican State. That's Louisiana's nickname, if I remember correctly. Then we'll hear from Kathryn Kline Tyndall with the Bipartisan Policy Center, a Washington, D.C. based think tank that fosters collaboration between both sides of the political aisle to develop common sense solutions to major national challenges. Kathryn will be followed by Lesley Jantarasami with the Smart Electric Power Alliance, or SEPA, a nonprofit with more than 1,000 member organizations, including utilities, technology companies, regulators, and policymakers working at the intersection of technology, policy, and programs to address the energy sector's most pressing challenges. Following these remarks, we'll open up the panel for questions and answers. Before we kick off, I have two housekeeping items for y'all. First, if you have any questions or comments, and we welcome them, please use the chat feature at the bottom of Zoom to enter your questions or comments. And as moderators will try and go through them. We may not get to all of them, but we'll share those questions as appropriate with the panel. And second, just for everyone's information, we will record this webinar and make it available on the States for the Future website at a future date. So with that said, without further ado, let's talk more about data centers. So our first speaker that we're honored to have today is Senator Thomas Presley, who represents over 120,000 Louisianans in the Texas Senate. His district is in Northwest Louisiana, and he's an attorney from Shreveport. And previously, Senator Presley served in the Louisiana House of Representatives, where he worked to advance tax, education, and healthcare policy. And the Louisiana Association of Business has recognized him as a most valuable player for his work advancing the interests of the business community. I should also say that Senator Presley does have a little bit of a Texas He is a proud alumnus of TCU, which we discussed earlier. It's in the Big 12, so he certainly spent some time, quality time, here in Texas. Senator, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We look forward to hearing from you.
Jeremy, thanks so much for having me on. I appreciate it. So I would love to share a little bit about my perspective. Is now the time to do that, Jeremy, or are you going to introduce everyone and then come back?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to just what I'll do is I'll just introduce everyone, and then
Perfect.
they can talk, and then we'll just do that for each speaker. Sorry about that.
Wonderful. That sounds great. I'm sorry, I must have misunderstood. Would you like for me to go ahead?
Yeah, please go ahead, Senator. I'm sorry.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with your group today. As you said, I have the great opportunity of serving in Northwest Louisiana. My colleagues in Baton Rouge often call me a Texas senator, but I'm actually a Louisiana senator. I've enjoyed that opportunity representing Northwest Louisiana. And I think the data centers bring a unique and interesting perspective to our economic opportunities in Louisiana. We are the heart and of the Northwest area of the state, of the Arklatex. We have the home of a four-star Air Force command at Barksdale Air Force Base. And so national security is really where we start our discussions on a lot of issues. And I think data centers is one of those issues that needs to start with national security. We know that this is an international game that's being looked at as to the security of our data. And for me, in Northwest Louisiana, we are being the home of the four-star command. National security is important. And I think it's important to realize that our data that's driving AI, that's driving opportunities to see enhancements with videos and ChatGPT. That all comes from a data center, and that is one of the things that we need to recognize and realize. And then you have the economic development side. That's also very important. We have announced in Louisiana $100 billion of investment, most of which is from data centers since Governor Landry took office some 2.5 years ago. Those are the very positive things. And then, of course, on the realistic side of what we need to make sure we are addressing, water is a massive issue. And we are blessed in our great state of having a lot of water resources, but we want to make sure that we have policies in place that work to make sense, as well as energy. Energy, of course, our national grid is essential. And my portion of the state has SWEPCO, which is an AEP company that also has lines in Texas and Oklahoma and Arkansas. So we are really tied together on that issue as well. And I think it's important that we pay attention to that. On the energy side, Louisiana has always stood for energy. We've produced it, we've transported it, we've refined it, and we've built communities around it. From the Haynesville Shale to industrial corridors, energy has supported thousands of jobs for Louisianians and really provided the foundation for economic development over the past century. I think energy, as we look at data centers, is important as well. And that's part of the reason that we've been so successful in our state of driving data centers to the area, and particularly Northwest Louisiana. We had an announcement with Stack and AWS that they are going to create 3 different facilities within the Shreveport-Bossier area that will drive some $20 billion in economic development. We also had the Meta project, which is in Richland Parish, a rural portion of Louisiana and North Louisiana, more on the northeast side, where they recently gave $50,000 stipends to every teacher in Richland Parish. It shows the tremendous opportunities that are available. And again, I think that you have to go back to those central tenets, water, of course, being one of those as well. And water is one of Louisiana's greatest assets. My friends in Texas often are trying to take our water or buy our water. And we want to make sure that we have the policies in place that allow us to be the beneficiary of that resource and hopefully the jobs and economic development and population growth that has come to many of the larger metropolitan areas in Texas. We're hoping to have some of those folks move to our region of the state, region of the country, and Louisiana. And of course, water supports our families, it supports our farms, our industries, and ecosystems. And we want to make sure that those policies that are being put in place work. Not only for the economic development, but for the long-term success of Louisiana. I was proud to carry a piece of legislation that's looking at non-coastal Louisiana's water resources. We just started that endeavor with an organization called Current, and the group is intended to work together across non-coastal Louisiana to ensure that our water is being used effectively and efficiently for programs, for business opportunities, and making sure that we're doing everything we possibly can to keep that clean water resource that we have. I think a strong water policy is not anti-development, but it's actually essential to the long-term success of our communities throughout the state, and we want to make sure we're focused on that as well. So, that's kind of where we are in Louisiana. I look forward to answering more questions as we go forward. But I do think that water and energy policy is essential for the long-term success of data centers and for that national security implications that we have, as well as the long-term and short-term approach to economic development, which data centers obviously are creating throughout our country.
Senator, thank you so much for being here this afternoon. We will have some questions for the panel after the next two presenters. And again, for the folks that are joining us this afternoon, if you have a question or if you have a comment, please feel free to put that into the chat. And then once everyone's done presenting, we can start going through the questions and have the expert panelists with us this afternoon share their perspectives. So our next speaker will be Kathryn Kline Tyndall, and she is the Associate Director with the Bipartisan Policy Center's Energy Program. Kathryn's working on energy policy with a focus on load growth, state utility regulation, and advanced energy technologies. Before joining the Bipartisan Policy Center, she worked at the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, also known as NARUC, focusing on load growth, electricity markets, nuclear energy, and coal and carbon management. Kathryn, thank you for joining us here today from Washington, D.C.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy, and really appreciate being able to join today's conversation. So my name is Kathryn Kline Tyndall, as Jeremy mentioned, and I work at BPC. If you'll go to the next slide. So today I wanted to share a little bit more about a project that BPC has been working on over the past 4 or 5 months, and we are currently wrapping up, and we'll be able to share more information about very soon. But since February, we've embarked on what we're calling the Key Considerations for Data Centers project. And really, this project focuses on recognizing that data centers are coming into local communities. How can we work with both data center developers and these communities to identify the pieces that need to come together to create better outcomes for everyone? So I'll dive a little bit more into that in a second, but if you'll go to the next slide. Quick word about Bipartisan Policy Center for those who are unfamiliar with us. We're a relatively new, we like to call ourselves a think and do tank because I work in the policy side of things where we're talking with people and creating ideas. And we also have a 501c3 arm that takes our ideas up to Capitol Hill and translates these ideas to supporting policy. So we were founded in 2007 by 4 former Senate majority leaders. And really their belief was that cooperation across party lines is essential to solving the nation's toughest challenges. So I got to see that and live that firsthand working at NARUC with state utility commissioners on both sides of the aisle. And I'm so happy to have brought this to be so mission driven at BPC. And really our focus is on advancing pragmatic solutions, improving lives, and building a stronger America. So BPC engages in a lot of work. We have a health and human capital area. We do economics, tax, policy, and I sit on the energy team right here. So if you'll go to the next slide. Yeah, so for our key considerations for data centers project, really, as conversations around data centers have grown so much in the past 2 years or so, it's become really apparent to our team that where data centers are built, how they're powered, and how communities and environmental impacts are evaluated have significant impacts on local communities and these outcomes long term. And so with that in mind, our belief is we're not here to litigate, whether data centers are good or bad, but we believe that careful conversation, forward planning, and better discussions around process can help to ensure that both data center developers and local host communities really have improved outcomes and are happy with where they end up. So this has been really a great time to have this conversation in light of increased public scrutiny. I think there was a Pew poll that came out a couple of months ago saying that up to 70% of Americans don't want a data center in their community. So it's a very timely topic. And as I'll unpack a little bit later, really one of the key things that we're seeing right now is we've got some very different actors who are engaging together who haven't traditionally worked together. And it's creating a scenario where we just have different cultural norms about how things are done. And so right now we're in a moment in time where there's a lot of opportunity to talk about what the process looks like so we can get to these better outcomes. So in this project in particular, we focused on what we're calling key considerations. And really the focus of this is understanding, so first of all, what are the areas that are impacted when a data center comes into a local community? What are the pieces? And then based on what those impacts are, whether it's higher property taxes, noise pollution, light pollution, things like that. How can you have proactive conversations to identify methods for mitigating these conversations? In this entire effort, it's really important to notice there's just a lot of local variation. Coming from the state level, we like to say there are 51 state laboratories. And so when you take this down to a local level, you're talking about even more groups. And they all really come with their own sets of values, thresholds for what's acceptable, and their own goals in these processes. And so with that in mind, this work project stream really isn't focused on telling people how to do things, but focuses on more identifying the pieces that should be included in a good conversation. Jeremy, could you go to the next slide?
Got it.
Okay, so a little bit more about our process. So in 5 months, BPC engaged in a series of Chatham House roundtable conversations around the country. A Chatham House rule roundtable is signified by you're allowed to share information outside of the group discussion, but you're not allowed to attribute it to any individual who is participating in that day. So there are no names, but you can see there's a bit of a breakdown of the types of people that we talk to. And based on these conversations, we focused on identifying what are the impacts that data centers have in communities, and then how should we think about supporting more proactive conversations and planning. So I come from the energy side, and this was really a wonderful opportunity for us and our team to expand our scope a little bit and talk to some people that we don't talk to normally. So in this process, we had the opportunity to talk with hyperscalers, data center developers, a lot of local, state, and some federal elected officials, a lot of local state staff, mayors in towns, financial institutions, utilities on the power and the water side, consumer advocates, environmental and community groups. A lot of great economic development folks were interested in engaging with us, as well as agricultural interest groups and researchers and academics that are thinking about these things. So we had a great series of discussions in San Francisco, Kansas City, Houston, and Washington, D.C. We did an online conversation to try to pull in some of the input. And honestly, we could have just continued traveling around the country because there's so much to hear, and there's a lot of voices in this conversation. But we had to stop it there. So next slide. So just a really quick overview of some of the things that are happening at the state, local, and federal level are outlined in this table. You can see there's a fair amount of moratoriums. I'm going to keep this really high level in the interest of time, and I'll just say a lot of the moratoriums that we're seeing proposed really are focusing on a pause effectively. So they're taking an 18-month or 2-year pause that really is focused on helping a state or a locality implement a better process and have a better understanding of what's going on before they proceed with these agreements. So again, as we talk about different stakeholders who haven't traditionally worked together and trying to reconcile processes, I think that's one of the big responses that we've seen are these moratorias. At the federal level, we've seen a couple of legislative proposals that have not really gotten very far, and some executive orders from the White House supporting AI deployment, and also DOE issued a request to FERC to consider some actions to support large load growth, which FERC had a meeting about this morning. So next slide, please. The rest of the time, I'm just going to touch on some high-level highlights, and then I'll wrap up by telling you what the timeline is for us to release our results. So our roundtable conversations were really interesting. Based on the locations you saw, Texas, Kansas City, San Francisco, there were some very distinctive regional themes that came out, as well as a lot of areas where there were general agreements. So most of these highlights really focus on areas where there was a lot of agreement from the participants that we talked to in the rooms. So first of all, there was a real interest in greater communication generally, and this was discussed in terms of greater transparency, greater access to data. So a lot of the local communities and decision makers at the local level really felt like they wanted to be able to communicate to their communities about the impacts and allow them to make these decisions. And sometimes that was just tough to do given the amount of information that they were able to share. There were a lot of concerns that were brought up from everyone really about trusted sources of information and trusted educators. And so one thing that's come up more recently is just sort of discussions about how foreign actors are engaging in dialogues around data centers, sharing misinformation, and pieces like that. So really the question is, who are these trusted people that can share information and educational materials on data centers? And how do we get them involved in processes? One of the things that people pointed to was opportunities for hyperscalers and developers to work directly with local communities, finding trusted community organizations or trusted community leaders who could help translate some of these messages and make them more heard. Additionally, there were a lot of concerns about stranded asset risk. So when you're looking at data centers, they frequently require infrastructure upgrades to water and electricity systems. So questions around who pays for the infrastructure and what happens if a data center doesn't pan out or if it doesn't stay for the lifetime that it expected to stay in an area were front of mind. And then the last one is really something I've touched on, but just a big mismatch in project pace between some of these data center developers who are looking for speed to power versus communities when we're talking about deliberative timelines and regulatory processes and permitting. Next slide. Senator Presley touched on this, so I'll be brief, but just understanding the water energy nexus was a really interesting piece that came up time and time again in our conversations. And so particularly one of the salient pieces was around data center cooling has come up a lot in the news. Obviously, you can use water for this. You can also use more water efficient methods, but there's a trade-off there. So in a lot of scenarios, you're trading off less water usage for higher electricity usage. So understanding those trade-offs and how that might impact your community and understanding your community's resources is an important piece to talking about what type of technology choices are being selected by data centers and communities. We also heard that local residents wanted clearer messaging around narratives for data centers. So just a lot of feelings and sentiments that the value add wasn't clear from a data center. So, you see really diffuse data center benefits, cloud computing, things that are not really focused on local communities. So data centers expressed a big desire to have that narrative and to have a better understanding and some clear discussions there. Next, noise and light pollution came up a lot in these conversations, along with issues like aesthetic concerns. So pieces of the conversation around planning and how can you proactively abate some of these issues is really an area that's ripe for conversation and planning processes. Next slide. We heard a strong interest in optimization of available land space. Particularly, a lot of these data centers are going into more rural communities at this point, and so land is a valuable asset. So we heard from many stakeholders just a desire for opportunities for things like brownfield redevelopment, utilizing existing infrastructure for industry that had already left an area. So these opportunities to preserve valuable land where possible was a win-win. Also thinking towards full lifetime cycles, people were concerned about data center decommissioning. And so just having that conversation about what would happen in different scenarios and front-loading those conversations could really provide some comfort to local communities having this conversation. So what's the plan if if a data center shuts down faster than their term, what happens to community benefit plans? How are different groups impacted? This ties back to pieces around the narrative, but people are really eager to see tangible benefits from property tax revenue. And there is also an interest in, all local residents seeing these benefits. And then finally, participants drew a sharp line. There's a lot of talk about, workforce is great. And participants were very assured about this. They said, there's a real difference about temporary construction phase employment opportunities for people versus long-term permanent positions. And there are a smaller number of permanent positions in a lot of these places. So people wanted, honesty, the truth. And there were also a lot of other pieces of this sort of employment conversation around wages, local hiring versus out of area hiring. And then also people discussed, these are some great union jobs on the construction site. So it's really been a boon there. So this is where I'll stop for now. BPC is excited to publish our final set of key considerations and a companion report that highlights some tools for having these conversations and some questions that we think are useful, along with an appendix of resources in mid-July, and you'll be able to find it on BPC's website. So I'll stop it there and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Kathryn. And Kathryn, I was remiss in mentioning earlier that we've both essentially worked for the same boss. Secretary Margaret Spellings used to be the head of Texas 2036 before she went to DC to head up the Bipartisan Policy Center. So give the secretary our regards when you see her next. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. Next, we'll hear from Lesley Jantarasami, who is the Vice President for Research and Industry Strategy for the Smart Electric Power Alliance, SEPA. And there she works to share solutions to the biggest challenges facing electric utilities, technology partners, and policymakers. She also works in support, and she also supports SEPA's work at the intersection of technology policy programs and aligning the organization's new focus areas of grid growth and globe, which seek to advance grid modernization and scale clean energy solutions to meet demand and leverage global insights to ensure clean, affordable, and resilient electricity for all. Also joining us from Washington, D.C. this afternoon, Lesley, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Jeremy. I am so thrilled to be joining this conversation because, as you said at the top, there is no bigger issue that we get asked about at all times from both members of SEPA and the energy industry as a whole is really thinking about how to grapple with these questions. And so my fellow panelists here, Kathryn and Senator Presley, really set the stage nicely with the conversation about how bigger picture economic development considerations, land use, water, and energy. And so we are now, with my presentation, going to deep dive a little bit more on the electricity policy side of things, and specifically looking at the tool, the policy tool, regulatory tool of state utility tariffs. And these are different from trade tariffs. So they happen to share the same name, but they are actually specific to electricity, and they are one of the tools that we can look at for data center load growth. If you can go to the next slide. So briefly about SEPA, you heard a little bit in the intro from Jeremy, but we really are focused on all of the suite of issues that the United States needs to focus on for ensuring that we have a clean, affordable, and resilient energy future for all. And so this really touches on all aspects of the energy ecosystem, from upstream, how we get our electricity to the users and the customers of electricity, and how we're ensuring that all of this is supporting America's energy future and the competitiveness of our economy. So if you could go to the next slide. We do this through our engagement with a very diverse member community of nearly 1,000 organizations representing that full spectrum. When you think about all of the players, the major players involved in getting your electricity from its point of, generation creation to the end user. And so we have both utilities and non-utilities technology companies. We have the regulators and the state policymakers who play an enormous role in determining the framework by which we have this system and how it works in different parts of the country. So we are a national organization. All of these 1,000 members really span all regions of the country. And so we really look at this from, a nationwide view, but we understand the regional differences and the unique circumstances that govern how these issues play out in different parts of the country. So if you go to the next slide, just taking that big view of what's happening with electricity demand in the United States. It's rising, as we all know, amid many considerations about what is happening in the system. We have an aging electricity infrastructure system where, we have electricity generators who need to retire. They reach the end of their useful life. So at the same time as we have new users wanting to come in the form of data centers, but also electricity users from industry, like manufacturing, from increasing electrification of things like transportation. We have a projection of US electricity demand that is rising for the first time in decades. And all of this is sort of on top of the backdrop of the need that some utilities are going to be retiring generation, and power producers are going to be retiring that generation. So how do we build more, right? How to fill both the need to kind of maintain a certain level of generation as well as meet this growing demand. And we're running up against challenges in the form of, the project pipeline is a bit stalled at the moment. We hear in the policy conversation at the national level, what can the federal government do around permitting reform to help unlock some of the bottlenecks that are facing these projects getting off the ground and getting built and putting new electricity onto the grid. But in addition to that, there are supply chain challenges from both the global and how do we source these pieces of equipment, and then how do we get them built. And so that timing mismatch that Kathryn mentioned is really pertinent in this consideration here. And at the same time, we are now seeing some more and more concerns around the affordability of electricity and energy and utility bills. So states and the industry itself is wrestling with what do we do, because we need to build more in order to meet this rising demand, in order to ensure we're capturing those economic benefits that Senator Presley mentioned. But we can't do this sort of at the same time as we need to understand what are all the tools available to keep prices affordable for everyday Americans and ensure that it's not becoming too much too quickly. And so these changing drivers, there's lots of data and projections around how this is going to play out. I think, it's a lot of modeling that goes into these questions that we don't necessarily have, all of the answers, but typically it's a range of what we're seeing. But one of the biggest things that I wanted to point out in this graph that I included here is that it's not always about the total electricity demand. Sometimes it is the peak demand. So if you have a very hot day in the summer, or you have a very cold snap in the winter, like in Texas with Winter Storm Uri, you will have, price spikes and electricity demand spikes to go along with those events. And so when we think about how to engineer and build and plan for reliability of the electricity grid, we do that by taking into account the understanding of how those peaks might change. And so with data centers, this becomes another complexity in the equation. So if then you go to the next slide, please. What are those frameworks? How do we then look at the tool set for new large loads coming onto the system, and what kinds of implications that has for the reliability of the electricity grid? So the conventional approach on the left is when you have a large load, typically in the past, this has been what is called a commercial or industrial customer. Usually it's like steel manufacturing or some other, large energy user that comes in and they request, to have basically standardized contract language that when they go to a utility or electricity load serving provider, they want to have that guidance on like what is in and out of my agreement when I connect to the grid and then get electricity from the utility. So the tariff is what sets the kind of big picture framework guidance for what that contract or that electricity service agreement looks like. So I point that out because the tariff itself is kind of the framework for it, but then the individual details will be included in the electricity service agreements that are actually confidential between business and the utility regulators. So we have a view into what's public, which is the tariff that gets approved by utility regulators at the state commissions. But we don't necessarily have the view into what is in the individual terms and conditions within an electricity service agreement. But that's the conventional approach. And within, in the past, large loads, you're talking about very large customers. You're talking about how, these designs are, trying to make sure that cost risk is being managed well. We saw kind of an evolution of this back a few years ago. It felt like a lot of people were worried about Bitcoin mining or crypto mining, big operations coming into places and sucking up all the electricity in order to mine cryptocurrency. We don't quite hear as much about that these days, but they were really on the front edge, the leading edge of a lot of new thinking about how to use tariffs, large load tariffs, to make sure there were boundaries set around what it would, these crypto miners could do in a certain utility service territory. And so large load tariffs evolved in that context. Data centers, I have to say, are not necessarily a new thing because, Kathryn and I live in DC, like right outside is Northern Virginia, which some folks have called Data Center Alley. This is been a focused point for data center growth since the 90s. And so they have had a lot of experience, decades of experience in siting and interconnecting, putting data centers onto the grid in Northern Virginia. And so more recently, when there's interest now in almost every region of the country in data centers connecting to the grid. And so you're seeing states who have policy mandates for a certain percentage coming from clean energy or renewable sources. They might put new conditions into their tariffs or create a new tariff that people can select that incentivizes more clean energy. So that's one ability to put into the tariff language some framework for an emphasis on clean. The other that we're kind of seeing in the development here is around flexibility. So can the data center sort of ramp up and down its usage of electricity? And if so, can we formalize that in the tariff because it benefits the grid in certain instances? So all of this is to say there's a lot going on in this space. I know this is just one slice of the different policy options to manage data center load growth, but for electricity folks, policy folks in the regulatory space, this is huge because really there hasn't been a lot of need to change these mechanisms in a long time until recently. So if you could go to the next slide. We developed in partnership with the North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center, a public educational resource we are calling Delta, the database of emerging large load tariffs. So, like I said, there's action for data center development happening in pretty much every region of the country right now. And so states who are wanting to get, ahead of this or just respond to it are in the process in various stages of either proposing or approving or modifying their existing set of tariffs governing large loads. And so the blue states here have approved tariffs that are sort of going on ahead. The orange is proposed tariffs, and then the crossed stripy ones have both approved and proposed tariffs, and it is because it is utility specific. So for different states, they are at different stages of this. So it's an ongoing evolution of what large load tariffs look like across the country. 36 states, 60 utilities, 77 different tariffs. So, and this is just from our Q1 update. We're about to publish another Q2 2026 update in July. So please take a look at our our database, you're able to download it as a spreadsheet and look at it yourself and dig into what those details are. So if you can go to the next slide. So again, I mentioned crypto mining, I mentioned, industrial manufacturing. Large load tariffs are not actually data center tariffs, right? Like they're large load because, customers there's a variety of different types of customers that are covered by these tariffs. And so one of the key policy considerations is how you're defining it and who falls within the tariff and who doesn't. And so on the left side here in the arrow, you'll see just also the evolution of the technology and the way that these data center campuses are built these days. They used to be more in the realm of kind of like a large steel mill or an oil refinery. But now data centers across the world, at least under construction, they haven't become operational yet, are trending in that very dark red side. It's like over 1,000 megawatts. It's enormous and like very hard to think about and wrap your mind around what does that actually mean for the grid. Because our grid, especially in the United States, we haven't needed to build or bring on new customers of electricity of that size in a very, very long time. And so I think it's trying to catch up to what is possible and make sure that our regulatory tools are, ready for this. And so early on in the large load tariff development, there were some that did target data centers by calling them out by name, like in the tariff. But generally today, we're seeing in the newer types of tariffs, 4 out of 5 of them that we have tracked in our database define the applicable, the eligibility in or out using a megawatt threshold. So it's a size issue. And so you'll see, but it varies by state. So this graph just shows that like the size of each tariff, it differs by geography and where this is. So if you can go to the next slide. The large load tariffs, again, because they are variable across the nation, they do include a lot of nuances in how they are going to be implemented. And so they create this like broad structure for helping to control costs, or at least putting, guardrails around the costs for new users on the system, and that responsibility of who pays. It gets codified into the tariff. But it's just one of many tools that state and federal policymakers can look at when they talk about how do we ensure a reliable and affordable grid amidst all of this load growth. And so I did just want to point out that there are other tools and ways that people are looking at the data center issue where the large load tariff is a complement because it can help codify or make formal that agreement to do something like the clean transition tariff is a commitment to clean energy within that construct, or there could be a commitment to demand flexibility or energy efficiency or other things wrapped up in the tariff. It can also, create an ability for the utilities to have better certainty, transparency, and information that they can do better planning and operations to meet that new data center load growth. And so it helps get them a better line of sight into what's real and what's not. And so if you go to the next slide, the reason I say what's real is because a lot of times people apply to join a grid, and they get into what's called a queue, where you might just say like, I just want, I want this much electricity and I'm going to come online in 2030. And the utility's like, are you sure you're going to do that? And so by creating tools within the tariff that actually requires putting money down, for example, like increasing the fees that utilities charge in order to join the queue, you can actually cut down the kind of speculation of let me just put my name in and like hold a place, even if it's not real, because the utility needs to know what's real and what's not in order to plan for it. And so you'll see here an example of what worked really well in Ohio for the utility AEP is cutting down on this huge queue and actually making it much more manageable to plan for. So this is a great development. And then other example state actions are listed here. And it's again how the tool of a large load tariff and what the utility commissions can do is it's complementary to what state legislatures are thinking about when they're considering different types of data center bills. Sometimes it is, governor directed. There are some executive orders out of Missouri, for example, that requested that the commission, investigate a new set of regulations for large loads and data centers. And so the different branches of government, I guess, all have a role here and are thinking about what their roles are in governing large load and data center development. And the large load tariffs sit within that, and they're one of the early signs of how these conversations are playing out. And then this map just shows how there's a lot of interest in data center presence across different parts of the country. But I always joke that as soon as you publish something like this, it's out of date, right? And because the world of data centers is just constantly evolving, and new announcements are coming out all of the time. And so the policy and regulatory community is really just trying to keep up. It is tough out there. So that is all I wanted to share today. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to the conversation and Q&A.
Lesley, that was some fantastic material. Thank you for providing us a great survey of how different states are approaching the large loads associated with data centers. So we'll move into some Q&A. We have some questions that we prepared in advance that we'd like to share. And I see that there are a few comments and questions popping up in either the chat or the Q&A. So if there's anything that you guys have in your mind that you'd like for us to present to the panel, if there's time, please put that in the Q&A function on the bottom of your Zoom screen. So one question I wanted to ask was, I think certainly here in Texas, a lot of the discussion is on the need for greater transparency with regard to data center development. Again, going back to those original questions, how much water, how much energy, what are the tax implications of data center development? But I guess the first question I wanted to start with, and we could perhaps start with Senator Presley, is what obstacles exist for obtaining reliable information on data centers, fiscal, operational, or otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, I think the misinformation and the bad information that's out there is a big challenge that we have. I was very happy with our local economic development group in Northwest Louisiana, who actually took some of our city council members and commissioners from our parish, our county, to other data centers, so they could see firsthand some of the challenges that we talked about, the noise, the light implications, and light pollution that some of the neighborhoods have. One of the data centers that's being built here is adjacent to a neighborhood. And obviously there were big concerns from the neighbors as well as from the community at large over what those implications were. Would we have a short-term challenge of a typical construction aspect of a couple of years of major construction and 18-wheelers coming through? Or was this going to be a forever situation where you have light pollution and sound pollution and health implications that come along with that? And I felt like that trip really solidified with leaders that can go back to their communities and speak directly to their neighbors and their constituents on what they saw firsthand, what they heard firsthand. And I think that really calmed the nerves of a lot of folks. Now, granted, there are a lot of people that are still very concerned about the long-term implications of the data centers, particularly in the community of area, as opposed to being in a more rural area. But I think that the conversations, the fact that we had a firsthand account, really helped. And I think that the companies did a good job of bringing in and hiring folks that had relationships within the community to be able to talk firsthand on some of the things that they were seeing and that they're guaranteeing. Regarding the upgrades to the power grid, for example, those costs are going to be borne by the companies as opposed to the everyday ratepayer, the local family that was fearful that they were going to have to pay for it. On the water side, our water infrastructure in Shreveport was built for a community about 3 times the size of what we have today, population wise. And we've seen the loss of some industrial opportunities and commercial opportunities here. This is really spurring the economic opportunities and spurring the redevelopment and investment in our water infrastructure that we need in order to, in order to not raise a significant amount of tax dollars by taxing everyday Louisianians. And rather that investment is going to be made, and there's already been $400 million that's been pledged to be made to our water system right here. So we're excited about that aspect while still being cautious and making sure we have the guardrails in place on the water and power in particular.
So I guess looking at, I have a question in the chat that I'd like to point towards Lesley. Evidently, Oklahoma recently passed a bill relating to electric restrictions. How does that fit into the spectrum of what states are doing when it comes to data center electric use?
I think that there is, opportunity for additional conversation and collaboration between the kind of utility regulatory side of the House and then the governor's and the legislature's side of the House. So when these types of bills come up or are passed, right, there's a conversation that needs to happen around how will it be implemented? How will the utilities in the particular state or jurisdiction respond? So I don't know the particulars of that piece of legislation, but I do think that there is robust mechanisms at the state level to ensure that those types of decisions and what happens in terms of restrictions gets reflected into the planning processes that utilities have to go through when they're making decisions about new projects and new pieces of infrastructure to serve that load.
Then I guess, Lesley, I have another follow-up question for you. I think the issue, and this relates also to something I was shared in the chat, where a lot of the growing thought in Texas, especially after Senate Bill 6 here, is for the data centers to either co-locate with other generation or to develop their own generation. Has there been much thought in terms of dovetailing data centers' load needs with other generation, but also specifically with generation coming from renewable portfolios? Leslie, I'd love to hear from you on that. And then, senators, it's very interesting. I know Louisiana certainly has the water. We're aware of that in Austin, but how are they approaching the energy issue and co-location in Louisiana as well?
Yeah, it's a very live question, and people are doing it in different ways and across different states. I think that you're seeing different examples of investments by data center developers or hyperscalers in, for example, reopening nuclear plants that had been, previously decommissioned. And what they're doing is not necessarily saying like we need to co-locate that but I want clean power in my portfolio that said like I, invested in this resource, and therefore there's an agreement between a hyperscaler or a data center developer and a clean energy generator, so that as long as the grid, is able to connect and serve that infrastructure, we can see investments in new clean energy technologies that come about because there are now more interest, either from the hyperscalers themselves or from state policymakers who decide to put conditions into their policies or regulations to create some sort of goal, target for clean energy procurement. So I do think that we've seen a lot of announcements that couple either renewables development, wind and solar, or nuclear, or geothermal has been a subject of a lot of interest in Nevada, because it would be one of the first times we're seeing that specifically through an investment from a hyperscaler. So it's very interesting. I think another recent example I would point out that doesn't get as much attention is aggregating demand flexibility. So these are smaller resources, distributed energy resources like rooftop solar or home-sited batteries that individually are quite small, in terms of their power capacity. But when you aggregate them across a region, you can actually pull a lot of flexibility into the grid from those resources. And so there's more attention now being paid to how do we create policy and different structures, business structures and contracts to support more of these demand side flexibility resources being available to meet this growing demand spike from data centers.
Senator, what's the co-location story in northwestern Louisiana?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of the conversation has been on, on the investment. I mean, our grid is aging like the rest of the country. There's been a lot of conversation on how do we enhance the grid, improve the grid, and make upgrades to our infrastructure, whether that be with substations, transportation lines, or just reinforcement of the systems themselves. And again, these systems, whether it be AWS or Stack or Meta, have come in and said, we'll actually pay for that upgrade. And that's beneficial to not only the data center itself, but also the long-term improvement to the grid. Has implications for local customers, for other economic development projects that will likely come through. And again, I mean, what's interesting is my understanding of the electric system is that we need to know and have predictability of the load, and the only way to do that is to know exactly what Lesley was talking about, which is how do you know that this company is going to come online? And I think there's been a lot of conversations on how do we ensure that we have that information and the long-term predictability so that we know exactly what we need to build, and how to make sure that the data center is being a positive for our community as opposed to being a challenge for us. And I think the demand response programs are a big part of that.
So I'd like to go back to Kathryn with the Bipartisan Policy Center. Kathryn, you said something very interesting where one of the fascinating manifestations of this data center debate is it's essentially like it's a clash of two cultures, where I suspect you have the tech folks on one side and then the policy folks on the other side. And candidly, living in Austin and being on the policy side for most of my life, that observation is that's pretty correct. Tech folks and policy folks definitely come from different camps. But how is the data center industry? I mean, how are you seeing that they're reacting to the claims for greater transparency or other considerations with regard to natural resources, including water and energy?
Yeah, this is a great question. Coming from sort of the public utility regulatory world, we used to joke. Well, I used to joke. I'll own it. That hyperscalers are sort of the move fast and break things crowd, and the regulators are the just and reasonable and deliberative processes. So, two very different perspectives on how things are happening there. And so really when we're getting into this and we're thinking about it, it's just really important that we have opportunities for people to understand where both sides are coming from on these conversations, and to provide these opportunities. And then one thing that we heard over and over from our roundtable participants are things like NDAs. While they might serve a purpose in protecting, competitive information early on in processes, really they loom large in local communities' concepts, and sometimes they might be used as an excuse not to share information. But there's just a very bad communities have negative perceptions of NDAs in particular and other ways to dodge transparency. So when we were having these conversations with our roundtable participants, a couple of angles really rose to the top as good ways to respond to these things. As Senator Presley said, just really the name of the game is community engagement. And this isn't something that we need to reinvent. Utilities do a great job at this. Pipeline developers do a great job at this. So, it's not rocket science. We just have to take the model that we know works, going into communities, talking with people, understanding what their local concerns are, and then responding directly to those questions. We heard, we like to hear what you can tell us, but just being upfront about what you're unable to share is also really helpful. And so some of these Goodwill efforts to do this public engagement are really critical in these conversations in gaining trust with communities. And then finally, I'll say one of the other positive things we heard is just like the iterative process, right? So you're starting with a group and they're gaining knowledge and understanding of the questions that come into play when you're looking at these developments. And then as those questions are answered, new questions are coming up. And so having a responsive process that continues to identify the important pieces and provide information where data center developers have that information, they can share it at the right level for a community audience is really an important practice.
Thank you, Kathryn. So we are at the end of the hour, and I think we'll wrap up in a quick minute. But I'd certainly like to personally thank Senator Presley, Kathryn with the Bipartisan Policy Center, and Lesley with the Smart Electric Power Alliance for taking the time for joining us this afternoon. Looking at the attendee list, we certainly had folks from Texas here, but evidently there were also individuals from other states, including Louisiana and Wisconsin and a few others based on what we can tell from here. But this has been a fantastic conversation, letting folks know about the different approaches in other states and on a national level. We will make both the slide deck and a recording of this webinar available on the States for the Future website. You can find that website here. It's www.statesforthefuture.org, as well as through texas2036.org. Again, I want to thank the panelists for their time and their expertise and insights. This was a fantastic conversation. I wish everyone a great holiday weekend, and thank you for being here. Have a good afternoon.